The candles had not yet burned down to their second mark when Emmeline heard her husband name his mistress the next Duchess of Ashford Hall, in the hall itself, in the room her grandmother had built, beneath the portrait of a woman who had once burned a letter rather than let it ruin a man who did not deserve saving. She did not move from the doorway. She had learned, in 4 years of marriage to the Duke of Ashford, that the most dangerous thing she could do in any room he occupied was to be seen before she had decided what she was. She stood in the shadow of the doorframe where the candlelight did not reach, and she listened, and she noted everything, the particular way the Duke's hand rested on the small of Lady Vane's back. Proprietary. Already, as though a contract had been signed, and the faces of the 3 men who witnessed the pronouncement, how 2 of them smiled with the careful neutrality of men who smell money changing direction, and how one of them, Lord Selwyn, did not smile at all. She would remember Lord Selwyn. She did not yet know how much she would have to remember him for. Had she known, she would have filed it away the same, and stood just as still. The Duke of Ashford was saying that Lady Vane had agreed to accept his protection in a more permanent arrangement, that the matter of the Duchess, he did not say Emmeline's name, she noted that too, the matter of the Duchess was in hand, and that they might all raise a glass to a more sensible future. There was the sound of crystal meeting crystal. There was Lady Vane's laugh, which Emmeline had heard many times, and could now finally classify correctly. It was not a social laugh. It was the laugh of someone who had been waiting a long time in a particular room and had just heard the key turn. Emmeline withdrew from the doorway before the candles shifted. She was very good at withdrawing. She had been practicing since the morning she arrived at Ashford Hall as a new bride of 21, with a trunk of her grandmother's books and no one on the road to see her off, and understood within the first quarter hour that her husband had married her fortune and her grandmother's unentailed property, and had not been made aware that the 2 would continue to be attached to a person with opinions. She went up the servants' stair, which was faster and entirely empty at this hour, and she went to the room she had converted 3 years ago into a working study. It had been a dressing room. She had needed neither the space nor the mirror, and she sat down at the desk and she opened the household accounts ledger. She did not open it because she needed to read it. She opened it because her hands wanted something precise to do, and because the act of settling columns, of matching expenditure against record, was the thing that had always kept her breath even when the rest of her was not. Her grandmother had taught her to keep accounts before she could properly ride. A figure, her grandmother had said, does not feel sorry for you. And it does not lie. It is one of the few things in this world that will tell you exactly what the truth is if you are willing to add up. Emmeline had been adding up for 4 years, and tonight the sum was due. She had 2 months. Parliament would sit at the end of October, and the Duke needed her signature on the property transfer before it did, the Ashford Hall deed, the Elmore farmlands, the timber rights that paid for roughly 1/3 of the Duke's annual maintenance, because her grandmother had been a woman of specific and legally uncomfortable foresight and had tied those assets to Emmeline's living consent. She had 37 days, precise, before the Duke's solicitor would begin the first round of formal pressure, and perhaps 60 before the pressure stopped being formal. She was aware of this because she had read every document placed before her with the attention other women in her position apparently did not, and because the solicitor, Mr. Hatch, had a habit of pressing his thumbnail into the corner of important pages, a tell she had catalogued in their very first meeting and had never mentioned to anyone. Tonight she had something she had not had 3 weeks ago. When she last sat in this chair and added figures by lamplight, she had Lord Selwyn's face, still and unsmiling, and the knowledge that at least one man in that room below had found the Duke's announcement something other than welcome news. She would need to know why. She pulled a sheet of paper toward her and began to write a list, not of names, not yet, but of questions shaped like ledger entries, each one a blank where a number should be, and she worked until the candles needed trimming, and then she trimmed them herself and worked on. Her name was Emmeline Ashford, née Voss, granddaughter of a woman who had built a hall, which was to say that she was the granddaughter of a woman who had understood that the ground under your feet was the only argument that could not be interrupted. She was 24, which was young, and she had been 4 years in a house that had tried very hard to make her feel she was none of the things she was, which was an education of a particular kind. She was not beautiful in the way that stopped conversations. She was the other kind, the kind whose face, once attended to, was unexpectedly difficult to stop attending to. She had not attended to it herself in some time. She had other things to attend to. She was still writing when the clock in the hall below struck 2. Mrs. Pottle found her there at 6:30. Because Mrs. Pottle had been finding Emmeline in that chair at unreasonable hours for 3 years and had developed a kind of resigned affection for the fact of it, and because Mrs. Pottle herself was always awake before the kitchen fires were lit for the simple reason that she did not trust anyone else to light them correctly. She was the Ashford housekeeper and had been for 19 years, and she was built like an argument that had never once been won against, with gray hair pinned so severely it seemed to be holding the rest of her face in position. She set a cup of tea on the corner of the desk without being asked. She looked at the papers spread across its surface. "You were at it all night," she said. It was not a question. I took an hour at 3. Took it on the chair or the bed? Emmeline looked up. Mrs. Pottle's eyebrow communicated several things at once. "I heard him," Mrs. Pottle said, when it was clear Emmeline was not going to answer the chair or bed question. "He was not quiet about it. The upper hall carries." She paused. "What are you going to do?" "I am going to find out what Lord Selwyn knows." Mrs. Pottle picked up the empty inkwell, which she did not need to move, examined it, and set it back down. "Lord Selwyn," she said carefully, "is a man with a great many opinions about a great many other men's business. I am aware. And he is a man who knew your grandmother. I know that too." "Then," said Mrs. Pottle, with the particular finality of someone who had decided to stop saying the thing they were about to say, "I will have breakfast ready at 7 and not before." She paused at the door. "He has asked for the morn carriage to be ready at noon. He is taking Lady Vane to view the East Farms." The pause this time was 1 degree quieter and 1 degree more pointed. "The East Farms that were your grandmother's." Emmeline looked at her. The cup of tea steamed between them. "Thank you, Mrs. Pottle. I don't imagine it's a particularly welcome piece of thanks." "No, but thank you all the same." Lord Selwyn called on a Tuesday, which surprised her because she had not asked him yet, and she was still in the stage of adding before she was ready to query. He arrived between the morning calls, when the house was at its quietest point, and he sent up a card with a note on the back that said only, "I knew Margaret Voss. I believe we should speak." He had the manners to be already in the library and studying the Voss family's collection of legal volumes when she came downstairs, which told her either that he was not trying to seem disinterested or that he was skilled enough at seeming so that he had arranged the scene in advance, with himself as the apparently disinterested party. She filed both possibilities. He was older than she had registered in the candlelight, past 60, with the kind of face that had settled into all its lines and was no longer surprised by them, and hands that had ink on the right forefinger and a small precise scar across the left palm that she did not ask about. He was the Earl of Selwyn, a modest title with an immodest estate in the north. And he sat in her library as though he had been invited there long ago and had merely now found the time to come. "You knew my grandmother," she said. "I did her legal work," he said. "For 11 years. The last 3 of which were almost entirely devoted to the documentation of this hall and these grounds and the specific conditions of their passage." He looked at her steadily. She was very specific. She was. "You have read all of it, every codicil." He nodded, as though this confirmed something he had expected but was glad to have confirmed. "Then you know," he said, "what the hall costs to maintain in a given year, and what the timber rights produce, and what the shortfall looks like without the Voss income attached." "I have those figures, yes, and you know," he continued, in the same even tone, "that your husband has been borrowing against the expectation of those assets for the past 2 years, on the understanding that the transfer documents would be executed at the latest by November." Emmeline's hands were very still in her lap. It was her grandmother's skill, the stillness. It had nothing to do with feeling nothing. "I was not aware of the borrowing," she said. "Though I suspected it. He has borrowed substantially." Lord Selwyn set his hands together on the table between them. "The creditor holding the largest portion of that debt is a man named Dunmore. Dunmore holds notes totaling more than the hall itself would bring on the open market, and Dunmore is Lady Vane's uncle." The silence that followed was the kind that has a weight and a shape. The weight was the thing she had been afraid to name, and the shape was approximately rectangular, the size of a document she had not seen. Emmeline named it inside herself, quietly, in the way she had learned to name dangerous things, without alarm, with only the precision the naming required, and then she set it next to the figures she already had and looked at the sum. "He is not trying to replace me," she said. "He is trying to transfer the assets to a structure he controls before the debt comes due, so that Dunmore is made whole through the family rather than through the courts. And Lady Vane," Lord Selwyn said, "would be a very neat instrument for that transfer. A new Duchess, if he could manage the nullity, or a Duchess in all but name if he could not, holding assets that had been quietly restructured in the interlude." "What kind of interlude would manage that?" Lord Selwyn looked at her. The look was not unkind, one in which the current Duchess became sufficiently ill to require removal to the country, or became sufficiently discredited that her signature on a document was no longer the thing standing between Ashford and ruin. He paused. "There is a third possibility. I have not confirmed it. I came here to ask whether certain things had changed for you recently. Your health, your temperament, your sleep." She thought of nothing particular at first, and then she thought of the tea, and stopped. She had been sleeping poorly for 3 months. She had told no one. She had attributed it to the marriage, to the household, to the kind of low vigilance that does not leave you when you live in a place that does not want you. Her hands moved once, a fractional thing, and stilled again. "The tea," she said. It came out perfectly level. Lord Selwyn's expression did not change. "I do not know that. I only know that your husband's man of business has been in correspondence with an apothecary in the city who specializes, if that is the word, in the management of difficult women's nerves." There it was. There was the shape of it, precise now, rectangular, the size of a letter that was somewhere in this house and that she was going to find. Emmeline looked at the window, where the morning light was moving across the floor in the slow, indifferent way that light moves when it has no stake in what is happening beneath it. She noted a sparrow on the outer sill and the sparrow's complete disregard and found it clarifying. "I will need to see the correspondence between my husband's solicitor and the apothecary," she said. "I will need it in original, not copied." "I thought you might," said Lord Selwyn, and he produced from his coat an envelope. She held it to the light by the window without opening it, not yet, and the paper was dense, which meant more than one sheet, which meant the correspondence had been ongoing. She put it in her desk drawer, which she locked with a key she wore on her wrist, alongside her grandmother's seal ring, and she turned back to Lord Selwyn, and they spoke for another hour about timelines and witnesses and the specific procedural requirements of a chancery proceeding, and when he left, he stopped at the door. "She thought you would manage," he said. "Your grandmother, she told me she had built the thing so that it would only pass in good faith, because she knew what her granddaughter's faith was worth. I am sorry it came to this use." "Don't be," Emmeline said. She built it knowing exactly what kind of use it might come to. She was not an optimist. He smiled, and it was a good smile for an old man's face, warm in all its lines. No, she was not. He left her with the envelope in her drawer and a new name on her list, Dunmore. She wrote it at the bottom and underlined it once and went back to the accounts. She had 29 days left. She began to spend them carefully. The Duke of Ashford noticed nothing wrong for the first 2 weeks, which was approximately how long Emmeline had calculated it would take, given that he was a man who had not really looked at her in going on 3 years, and who had therefore lost the ability to detect changes in a face he was not watching. He passed her at dinner on Tuesday and Thursday evenings. She had kept to the dinner routine, because disappearing from the table would have been noticed by the household, and she had no intention of disturbing the household. And he spoke to her about the weather and the hunting, and once about a bill before Parliament that would affect the northern roads, and she answered him in the smooth, uninflected way she had been answering him for years, and he registered nothing. She was, in those 2 weeks, doing 3 things simultaneously, which was not unusual for her. She was, her grandmother had once said, the only person she had ever known who could keep 5 separate ledgers in her head and reconcile them all at once without losing a penny. The first thing she was doing was having the tea tested. This required delicacy and a degree of misdirection that she managed by the simple expedient of asking Mrs. Pottle to replace the kitchen order on grounds of quality. She had found the last 2 shipments inferior, and to see that the old supply was bottled and set aside, 1 bottle to be sent to her London physician for his assessment, and 1 to be held in reserve. Mrs. Pottle did not ask any questions. She had the face of a woman who had already asked the questions internally and arrived at conclusions she was keeping in a locked drawer of her own. The second thing she was doing was building a picture of the money. She had Lord Selwyn's envelope, which she had now read 6 times. It contained 3 letters between the Duke's solicitor, Mr. Hatch, and an apothecary named Gresham, who specialized in compounds for the management of female nerves and hysteria, and it confirmed that a preparation had been supplied to Ashford Hall beginning in April, in the form of a proprietary blend described as a calming tisane suitable for addition to ordinary household tea, and that 2 further supplies had been sent in June and August. It confirmed that payment had been made through a third party described only as D. The shape of the D sat in her ledger alongside the name Dunmore and cost her precisely 1 moment's anger, which she allowed herself and then set down. The third thing she was doing was watching the servants, which was to say she was watching which of them left the house, and at what hours, and whether any of them returned with the particular look of a person who has delivered something and been paid for the delivery. She had been watching servants her entire adult life, not with suspicion, but with attention, in the way that the sort of person who lives on the edges of a household learns early to attend, not looking for wrongdoing, but for pattern, which is a slightly different thing and harder to hide from. She found what she was looking for on the 9th day, in the form of a footman called Rue, who had been with the household for 14 months and who made a point of collecting the Duke's correspondence from the Morning Post before Mrs. Pottle or anyone else could handle it, which was a habit sufficiently innocent in isolation and sufficiently irregular in practice that she had noted it without comment 3 months ago and was now noting it with comment to herself. She was also, in those 2 weeks, paying close attention to her own health, which was improving in a systematic and entirely predictable way now that she had stopped drinking the tea. She was sleeping. She was clear in her mornings. The headaches that had been visiting her since May had not visited since the 2nd week of September. She noted all of this in a small journal she kept inside the back cover of her grandmother's household management text, which was the least likely book in the house to be examined by anyone. It was on the 14th day that the Duke came to her study. She heard him on the stair. His tread on the upper landing was heavy and slightly left-leading, a thing she had mapped the first month, and she closed the journal into the household text and moved both to the shelf before he knocked. He did not wait for her answer. He had never, in 4 years of marriage, waited. He stood in the doorway in the way he always stood in any door he occupied, as though the door existed as a frame for him, the room behind him a secondary consideration. He was handsome in the technical sense that his features were arranged correctly, and he had the height and the breadth of shoulder that painters seem to feel was historically appropriate to his rank, and he had eyes that were a clear, uncomplicated gray, and they were at this moment doing something she had learned to recognize and had never grown comfortable recognizing. They were assessing. "You have been very quiet," he said. "I have always been quiet. Not this quiet." He came into the room without being invited, which was also how he always came in. He looked at the desk, the papers on it, the ledger open beside them. "You are doing the household accounts. I always do the household accounts." Yes, he picked up the pen she had set down, turned it in his hand, set it back. It was his particular dominance gesture. The taking up of objects in her rooms, she had classified it in the first year and stopped being troubled by it. "I have been considering the November documents. Mr. Hatch tells me we are behind schedule." "I have been unwell." His eyes moved to her, the assessment recalibrating. "You seem better." "I am improving. I am glad of it. We must be in London by the 22nd. There are matters requiring your signature." He paused, and the pause had a shape to it, an enclosed quality, the sound of a man fitting a box around a sentence to manage its edges. "Lady Vane has asked to accompany the party." Emmeline looked at him with the clear, even look she had been practicing since she was 19, and her grandmother had told her that the most powerful thing a woman could do in a room full of people who wished to manage her was to require them to manage more than they had planned for. "How interesting," she said. He waited for the rest of the sentence. She did not produce it. Something moved in those clear gray eyes, not discomfort, exactly. The Duke of Ashford was not a man who easily found that country, but a fractional adjustment, as though the calculation he had been running had returned a number he had not expected. "I will need the household inventory completed before we go," she said, "for the November transfer. I wish everything to be precisely documented. That seems thorough. My grandmother was thorough. I believe the sentiment transfers." He looked at her for a long moment. She returned his gaze with the exact degree of compliance that had always satisfied him before, which was to say with the surface of compliance and nothing else, and he seemed to find it adequate. "Good," he said, and left. She opened the household management text as soon as his step reached the lower landing. She wrote, "He knows I am doing something. He does not know what. The window is smaller than I thought." And then she wrote the date, and beside it, 15 days. She spent 3 of those days finding Rue's letters. She found them inside the leather case Rue used to clean the silver, which was somewhere no one went except Rue and Mrs. Pottle. And Mrs. Pottle had known where to look because Mrs. Pottle had suspected Rue for 2 months and had been waiting to be asked. They were not Rue's letters. They were copies, made in Rue's hand, of the morning correspondence between the Duke and Mr. Hatch, and between the Duke and a man called Dunmore, and the copies went back 9 months. Rue had been making them since January, which was either a remarkable instance of advanced preparation or evidence that someone had instructed him to begin, and the hand was too neat and too consistent for a man who had been improvising. Someone had been asking him for the copies since January. She spent one evening considering who, and arrived at Lord Selwyn, and decided it did not change anything useful. What the letters told her, once she had spent an evening with them and her own ledger and the correspondence from the envelope, was the precise shape of the debt and the precise shape of the plan, and both were starker than she had already calculated, which she had not thought possible. The debt was 3 times the annual income of the Ashford estate, without the Voss properties attached. Dunmore held it in notes that fell due in December. The plan was, obtain Emmeline's signature on the transfer documents in November, having if necessary managed her into a state of sufficient confusion or ill health to smooth the process, transfer the Voss properties into the Ashford estate, allow Dunmore to attach to the estate assets as secured creditor, settle the debt by January, leaving Lady Vane positioned as the next intended Duchess, pending a nullity action that Mr. Hatch believed could be arranged through a cooperative ecclesiastical court if the current Duchess could be shown to be of unstable temperament. There was one letter that used the words nervous collapse in the way a man uses words he has been told to use, carefully, without explaining where he heard them. She read that letter 3 times. She felt the anger precisely, in its particular clean shape, and she set it in the place inside her, where she kept things that would be useful later, and had no room yet. And then she made herself a cup of ordinary tea, which Mrs. Pottle had laid in from a lockable cabinet in her own room, and she worked until the fire burned down. On the 18th day, she went to find Mr. Greaves. Mr. Greaves was the estate's land steward, a man of 50-something with the flat practical face of someone who had spent 30 years outdoors measuring things against each other, and he had been at Ashford longer than the Duke had been the Duke. He did not like the Duke, which he had never said in Emmeline's presence, and which she knew the way she knew most things, by the particular economy of his silences, and the way he treated the under-gardeners on days when the Duke had been through the grounds. He treated Emmeline, by contrast, with the specific restrained respect of a man who had noticed that she could read a field survey and that she asked the right questions about drainage. She found him in the estate office, which was a room attached to the stable block and smelled of old paper and boot polish, and something that might have been the ghost of every autumn afternoon ever spent tallying harvest yields. She put Lord Selwyn's envelope on the table in front of him, and she sat down across from it, and she said, "I need to show you something, and then I need to know if you will stand witness to it." He read the letters in the envelope without commenting. He read them the way he read a field survey, from the beginning to the end, noting nothing aloud but missing nothing. When he had finished, he put the papers together, squared them, and set them back in the envelope with his thumb leaving a small clean print on the flap. He looked up. "The apothecary letters," he said. "Yes, and the correspondence from Dunmore." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Your grandmother." It was not a question, and it was not a statement. It was the kind of thing a man says when he has arrived at a feeling he does not have a word for, and has decided the name of the person who caused the feeling is the closest available substitute. She built the deed precisely to prevent this. But the deed only holds if I am competent to refuse it. If my competence is successfully called into question by a physician, by a court record, by a sufficiently documented history of nervous instability, then it doesn't hold. He looked at the envelope. What do you need from me? The inventory, she said. I need the full estate inventory, completed and witnessed before we leave for London. Everything on Ashford land and in this house, down to the last bolt on the last gate. She paused, including the household stores, including the medicinal stores. He looked at her for a moment, and the look was the look of a man who had understood everything that was not in the sentence. I'll need 3 days. You have 4. We leave on the 22nd. He nodded. He picked up his pen, which was the gesture that meant, in his particular lexicon, that the meeting was complete and the work had already started. She stood and went to the door, and he said, without looking up, she would have enjoyed this part. She stopped. Which part? The part where it comes to a fight, and it turns out you've been keeping the books. He made a small mark on the survey in front of him. She told me once that the only battle worth fighting is the one where you already know the count. Emmeline looked at his bent head, and his ink-stained right hand, and the autumn afternoon pressing through the high office window. Yes, she said. She did say that. The blow came 4 days before they were due to leave for London, and it came from the direction she had anticipated least, which she filed as a lesson about which directions she gave the least consideration to. She had been watching the Duke and Mr. Hatch and Rue and the routes of the correspondence. She had not been watching Lady Vane. Lady Vane arrived at the Hall on the 18th day on a social call, which was not unusual. She had been a frequent caller for 2 years, always on the correct pretext of friendship, always at the hours when the Duke was out, and the house therefore apparently safe, and she was shown to the morning room, and Emmeline came down to receive her with the automatic hospitality that had become. Over 4 years of managing this household's social calendar, entirely indistinguishable from genuine pleasure. Lady Vane was beautiful in the way that announces itself, the kind of beauty that enters a room before the person does, that reorders the furniture of a social occasion simply by its presence, that knows its own value with the perfect unself-consciousness of the very rich knowing the value of money. She had auburn hair, which she wore with the elaborate naturalness of something maintained at considerable cost, and a laugh that carried without ever seeming to project, and a habit of setting her hand on your arm at moments of particular warmth that felt genuinely warm, and was also, Emmeline had long understood, a means of establishing a physical asymmetry in the conversation. She sat in the morning room's best chair by the window, and she set her hands in her lap, and she looked at Emmeline with an expression of such crystalline kindness that Emmeline felt the first cold finger of awareness move across the back of her neck. I wanted to come to you privately, Lady Vane said, before London, because I think you deserve, I believe you have always deserved, more honesty than you have been given. Emmeline poured the tea, which was from the kitchen supply, and therefore not the tea she was concerned about, and she set a cup in front of Lady Vane and kept the pot between them, and she said nothing, because the silence was a question she was not yet ready to voice. I did not choose this, Lady Vane said. I want you to understand that. What there has been between Ashford and myself, he is not a man who offers choices. He is a man who presents arrangements and expects them to be accepted, and I imagine you know this better than I do. She paused, and her lovely face rearranged itself into something that was meant to be sorrow, and was instead something adjacent to it, a well-made copy of sorrow. Competent, but slightly off the grain. I tried to discourage it. I told him it was not right. He said it did not matter. Emmeline listened. She listened with the same precise attention she brought to a column of figures, because a column of figures presented as a certain kind of problem was always doing something slightly different than it appeared, and the question was never what it said, but what it had been arranged to say. "He means to move very quickly in London," Lady Vane continued. "He has told me there are documents for you to sign that will make the transfer clean and quick, and that afterward the arrangements could be made to seem more natural." Over time, she set her hand on her own wrist in a gesture that was meant to communicate distress. "I wanted you to know that you can refuse, that whatever he may have led you to believe about the documents, you are not without resources. Your grandmother's deed is very specific." There it was. There was the second shape inside the first shape, the secondary ledger under the primary one. She knows about the deed, Emmeline thought. She knows about the deed, and she is here to find out how much I know. Emmeline looked at Lady Vane with the face of a woman receiving a difficult confidence with gratitude. She had been perfecting this face for 4 years. It was possibly the finest single instrument she had developed. "Thank you," she said. "This is very kind. You must protect yourself." "Yes, and if there is anything, any assistance I can offer, any information that might help, you've been more than generous," Emmeline said. She set down her cup. "I hope the journey to London will not be tiring. The roads in October are so variable." Lady Vane looked at her. For one moment, a very brief one, a flash, and then it was closed again. The face behind the kindness was visible, and it was a different face entirely, and it confirmed every calculation Emmeline had made. Then the kindness was back, and Lady Vane said something gracious about the roads and rose to leave, and Emmeline walked her to the door and watched her carriage pull down the drive and came back inside and went directly to the estate office, where Mr. Greaves was still at his table. "How much of the inventory is done?" she said. He looked up. 3/4, maybe more. "Can you have the medicinal stores section ready by tonight?" He looked at her with the flat professional steadiness that was his version of asking a question. She gave him the very abbreviated version of the answer, which was, "Lady Vane came to warn me about the transfer documents. She did not come to warn me about the transfer documents." He picked up his pen. "Tonight," he said. She was dismissed that evening. Not dismissed, nothing so crude. She was managed, which was the Duke's preferred instrument, because dismissal could be contested and management could not. It simply shifted the angles of the room until the person being managed found that all the available directions led somewhere the manager had chosen. The Duke came to her after dinner with Mr. Hatch behind him, and Mr. Hatch had a face of such professional neutrality that it conveyed its message by its neutrality alone, which was that whatever was about to happen had been decided some time before this evening, and this was merely the delivery. The Duke told her, in the measured tone he used when he was certain of his ground, that her physician had expressed concern. She had not seen her physician in 6 months, which she noted without expression, that she had been overworking, that the autumn in the country had always suited her, and that the London trip might better be made without her while she rested. Mr. Hatch produced a document that required her signature. It was a power of attorney, very neatly drawn, authorizing the Duke to act on her behalf in certain property matters during her period of recuperation. There was a second document behind it, which she glimpsed and did not appear to recognize. Though she recognized it completely, it was the Voss property transfer, prepared for her signature. She looked at the power of attorney. She looked at the pen Mr. Hatch was offering. "I will need to read this," she said. "Of course." The Duke's voice was the one he reserved for patients he did not have. "Take whatever time you need." She read it at the speed she always read legal documents, which was the speed of a person reading carefully, and she set it down and said, I believe this document has an error. The property description in the fourth clause does not match the actual acreage of the Eastern Elmore parcels as recorded in the original deed. It is short by 6 acres. Silence, the pleasant, uncomplicated silence of a room in which a calculation has just been disrupted. Mr. Hatch's thumbnail pressed into his sleeve. Mr. Hatch will review it, the Duke said. Yes, and in the meantime, I think I should rest. She rose. I will ring if I need anything. She went upstairs. She went directly to Mrs. Pottle's room, which was on the upper corridor beside the linen press, and she knocked twice and was admitted, and she told Mrs. Pottle what she needed, and Mrs. Pottle listened with the expression of a woman who has been waiting 4 years to be asked to do the useful thing. The letter from the physician, Emmeline said. There will be a letter. It either came through Rue or it was manufactured outright. If it came through Rue, there will be a copy. There's a copy, said Mrs. Pottle. I have it. Emmeline looked at her. I have been keeping copies of certain things, Mrs. Pottle said, with the tranquility of a woman who has been calmly building a case for 2 months against a possibility she sincerely hoped would not arise. Since July. She opened the same locked cabinet from which she had been supplying Emmeline's tea, and she produced a bundle of papers, and the bundle was bound with the same pale twine she used to tie the kitchen accounts. Emmeline took it. She sat down on Mrs. Pottle's single chair and read everything in the bundle, which took her 40 minutes, and when she was done, she had the letter from the physician, not from Emmeline's physician, from a Dr. Nall in the city, whom she had never consulted, and whose endorsement had apparently been purchased at around the same price as the apothecary's, and she had 3 more letters from Dunmore, and she had a note in the Duke's own hand to Lady Vane, that contained a sentence she read twice and set carefully in the part of herself where the useful things were kept. She slept 4 hours and rose before dawn. She wrote 2 letters before the house was awake. One to Lord Selwyn, requesting that he come to the Hall at the earliest possible date and bring with him an authority of unimpeachable neutrality. She suggested the Chancery Registrar he had mentioned, or in the alternative, the magistrate for the Ashford district. One to Mr. Greaves, to have the full inventory, witnessed and sealed, in her hands before noon. She gave the letters to Mrs. Pottle, who had not slept either, and who took them with the look of a woman who had been waiting to carry exactly these letters, and was gratified to find they existed. Then Emmeline went back to her study and she opened the household accounts ledger, and she made, in the column for the 21st of October, a single entry. It read, Accounts prepared for final audit, and beside it, in the small, precise hand her grandmother had taught her, the way out is through the middle. In the light, with witnesses, she had 11 days remaining. She spent them being very, very quiet, and very, very present, and very, very certain of every figure she had. Lord Selwyn arrived on the 28th with a man named Treville, who was Chancery Registrar for the county and had a face built entirely for the expression of official neutrality. Mr. Greaves came with them. Mrs. Pottle had already organized the morning room in the configuration Emmeline had requested, which was to say with the chairs placed so that the light from the east windows fell on the table at the center of the room, and left the outer edges in relative shade, and with a writing surface set to one side that held, in order, the household accounts ledger, the estate inventory sealed and witnessed, the letters from the physician who was not her physician, the letters from Dunmore, the apothecary correspondence from Lord Selwyn's envelope, and a small bottle sealed with wax that had come back from her physician in London the week before. The Duke received Lord Selwyn's arrival with the particular composure of a man who does not know the shape of the problem yet and is reserving his response until he does. He received Mr. Treville with visible calculation, which settled itself into a pleasantness that was the pleasantness of a man buying time. He did not look at Emmeline any differently than he had looked at her for 4 years, which was to say he looked at the approximate location where she was and registered something that was close to her, but not quite her. Lady Vane had arrived the evening before, because the London party had been rescheduled. She sat at the morning room's south end in a blue dress that was precisely the right dress for a woman who wished to seem a bystander, which made her, to Emmeline's eye, the most obviously interested party in the room. Rue was in the corridor. Mr. Hatch had come as the Duke's man. Mrs. Pottle stood against the wall near the door with the particular stillness of a person who has no official standing and intends to be entirely unmovable. Lord Selwyn sat across the table from the Duke, and he said, in the comfortable tone of a man who has done this sort of thing before and finds it more tedious than alarming, "There has been a concern raised regarding certain documents prepared for Her Grace's signature and certain other documents that appear to have been used in preparation for those signatures. Mr. Treville is here as a neutral instrument. No one is being accused of anything at this point. We are simply reading some things together, in the light, and seeing what they say." The Duke said, "I don't understand what this proceeding is." "It is informal," Lord Selwyn said pleasantly. "Should it become formal, you would of course want your own counsel present. That is entirely your option." The Duke looked at Mr. Hatch, and something moved between them. The quick subterranean communication of two men who have been in difficult rooms together before and know each other's signals. "Proceed," the Duke said. Lord Selwyn began with the apothecary letters. He read them aloud, slowly, in the tone he might have used for a parish register, the dates, the amounts, the description of the compound, the reference to the third-party payment coded as D, and the room was very quiet while he read, and Emmeline watched Mr. Hatch's thumbnail find the edge of his cuff and press. He read the physician's letter next, the one from Dr. Nall in the city, and he read the date of it, and then he said, "Mr. Treville, I believe Her Grace has something relevant to this date." Emmeline picked up the small sealed bottle and held it to the light from the east windows, and she said, in the even voice she had been practicing since she was 19, "This is a sample of the household tea supply, as it stood on the 14th of September, before I had the supply replaced. It was assessed by my physician, Dr. Linstow of Hart Street, whose written assessment is with Mr. Treville." She set the bottle on the table in front of Mr. Treville. "The assessment is dated October the 3rd. It was made 3 weeks before Dr. Nall's letter, in which Dr. Nall describes my current state of nervous instability." Mr. Treville looked at the bottle. He picked it up. He held it to the light himself, with the deliberate care of a man performing the gesture for the record, which was in his head, but was no less a record for that. "And Dr. Linstow's findings?" Emmeline produced the physician's letter and set it beside the bottle. Mr. Treville read it with the same deliberate care. He set it down. He said nothing, because he did not need to say anything. The letter was being read by everyone else in the room who could read, which was everyone, and the thing that the letter said had a sound as it settled into the room, a sound like a key turning in a lock that has been very carefully prepared. Lady Vane stood. It was not a dramatic stand. It was the stand of someone who has realized the angle of the floor has changed and is adjusting their weight before they fall. Emmeline looked at her and found, looking, that the anger she had been storing had somewhere in the past hour converted into something else, something quieter and more final, which was pity. Not easy pity, not the pity that excuses, but the pity that sees the whole shape of a person and is sorry for the waste of it. "I should like to ask Mr. Rue a question," Emmeline said. Rue was in the corridor. Mrs. Pottle opened the door, and Rue came in with the face of a young man who has been frightened for some time and is now past the point where being frightened is useful. He was not a bad young man. Emmeline had always thought he was not a bad young man. He was a young man who had been pointed in a direction by someone who held something over him, and the holding had been sufficient. She looked at him steadily. "The copies you made of the correspondence," she said. "Were they requested by Lord Selwyn?" Rue looked at Lord Selwyn, and then at Emmeline, and then at the floor. "No, Your Grace. Then, who asked you to make them?" The silence was the kind that has a person inside it. Everyone in the room knew who was inside it. Emmeline watched Rue look at Lady Vane with the specific look of a person who has believed, up until this exact moment, that the arrangement they are part of is more solid than it is turning out to be. Lady Vane was looking at the window. The sparrow that had been on the sill was gone. "Lady Vane," Rue said. It came out quietly, the way things come out when the effort required to keep them in has simply run out. Lord Selwyn nodded once, the small, efficient nod of a man who has just watched a column balance. The Duke of Ashford was very still. He had been very still for the last several minutes, and the stillness was a different stillness than Emmeline had seen from him before. It was not the stillness of a man who was certain. It was the stillness of a man in whom several certainties were being quietly removed, one at a time, like floor planks, and who was becoming aware that there was less ground under him than he had calculated. He looked at Lady Vane, and in the look there was something that was not about Emmeline at all, something older and more personal. The look of a man realizing that the person he believed had been on his side had been on a different side entirely, and that the two had only coincided for as long as it was useful. Lady Vane, for her part, looked at the Duke, and the face she showed him now was the face Emmeline had glimpsed for 1 second in the morning room 2 weeks ago, the true face, the one that had been doing arithmetic since January, and the arithmetic was its own kind of answer. Lord Selwyn produced the last document. It was the note in the Duke's own hand to Lady Vane, from Mrs. Pottle's bundle, and he set it on the table, and he read aloud the sentence Emmeline had read twice in the early morning, the sentence in which the Duke had written that his wife's health had always been her weakness, and that with the right management over the course of the autumn, the London trip would go smoothly. He read it in the same tone he had used for everything else, which was to say the tone of a man recording a fact for a register, and the sentence read aloud in that tone was its own kind of forensic instrument. It did not need to be argued. It merely needed to be heard by the right people, and it had been. Mr. Treville made a note in his own register, which was a small leather book he had produced from his coat, and which had been accumulating notes throughout the proceeding with the quiet steadiness of a running account. The Duke said nothing for a long time. When he spoke, it was not to Emmeline and not to Lord Selwyn. It was to Mr. Hatch, and it was, "Leave us." Mr. Hatch left. Emmeline said, "Before the Duke could speak, I have no interest in a public accounting. I want you to hear that plainly." He looked at her. The gray eyes, uncomplicated as ever, but rearranging around an unfamiliar premise. "The estate has debts," she said. "Those debts can be managed if the Voss income is properly applied, rather than transferred. Lord Selwyn has prepared a revised administration arrangement that keeps the income attached to its proper legal conditions and retires the Dunmore notes over 4 years at terms Dunmore has provisionally accepted." She paused. He accepted because the alternative, given that these letters exist and that Mr. Treville has seen them, is a public chancery proceeding in which Mr. Dunmore's correspondence with the Duke of Ashford about the management of the Duke's wife's health would be a matter of record. "The arrangement protects your name," she said. "It protects the title. It protects the household, which is full of people who have nothing to do with any of this and do not deserve to have their positions dissolved because their employer was in difficulty." She set her hands together on the table in front of her, the way her grandmother had set her hands. "I am not asking you to be grateful. I am telling you what the accounts require." He looked at her for a long time. She had the experience, for possibly the first time in 4 years, of being genuinely seen, which was not comfortable for either of them. "And Lady Vane," he said. Emmeline looked at Lady Vane, who was standing at the south end of the room in the blue dress, with her hands at her sides and her face arranged in an expression that Emmeline could finally read correctly now, which was not cruelty and not triumph and not even calculation, but something that sat just below all of those, a long acquaintance with a world that had never offered her a version of. Security that did not have to be taken from someone else. It was possible to see this and be sorry for it and still require her to go. "Lady Vane will leave the county," Emmeline said. "Quietly, within the fortnight. There is a property in the Western District that has nothing to do with any of this and which has been untenanted since spring. Lord Selwyn's office will arrange it." She looked at Lady Vane directly. "It is not a punishment. It is a conclusion." Lady Vane said nothing. After a moment, she picked up her gloves from the arm of the chair beside her, and she looked at Emmeline, and in the look there was something Emmeline had not expected and would think about for some time afterward, a kind of recognition, stripped of every strategic layer. One woman reading another across the specific shared inventory of what it costs to operate in a world that requires you to work harder than any of this should have required. She did not nod. She simply left the room, and her step in the corridor was entirely quiet, and presently they heard a carriage. Mr. Travell closed his little leather book. He looked at Emmeline with the expression of a man who has performed his function and is at peace with having performed it well. "Mrs. Pottle," Emmeline said. "Your Grace, I believe Mr. Greaves is outside. Would you ask him to come in?" "I should like to introduce him to Mr. Travell as the estate's primary witness for the inventory." Mrs. Pottle's face did the thing it did when she was about to do the exact thing she had been hoping to be asked to do and was restraining her satisfaction to a professionally appropriate level. She went. The Duke looked at the table. He looked at the documents arranged on it. He looked at them the way a man looks at a set of figures that have been correctly kept and that cannot, try as one might, be made to say something different than what they say. "You will let me read the administration arrangement," he said. "Lord Selwyn has a copy for you. And Hatch. Mr. Hatch is not party to the arrangement. Lord Selwyn's office will serve as the sole administrative contact until the Dunmore notes are retired." A very long pause. Outside, somewhere in the gardens, a bird was singing the particular song that a bird sings when November is still weeks away, and the morning is clear and warm, and none of what is happening inside any nearby building has the slightest bearing on its business. "It is a remarkable document," the Duke said at last, "the deed your grandmother wrote." "Yes," said Emmeline. "It is." He was quiet another moment, and then something happened in his face that was not quite humility and not quite respect, and was possibly the earliest, most unwilling evidence that both were latent in him after all. "She was a thorough woman," he said. "The sentiment transfers," said Emmeline. Mr. Greaves came in, and the rest of the morning was figures and signatures and the sound of pens on paper, which was the sound, her grandmother had always said, of the world being correctly accounted for. Afterward, in the garden, in the clear October light, Lord Selwyn stood with his coat on and his hands behind his back, looking at the hall's south front, which was old stone and good proportion, and her grandmother's hand in every measured line of it. "There is a question," he said, "that I have been waiting to ask you." Emmeline stood beside him. The sparrow was back on the window ledge above. "What becomes of you now?" he said. "Not the hall. Not the estate. You." She had been thinking about this. She had been thinking about it in the way she thought about figures that were in motion and had not yet settled, with attention, but without forcing the resolution before the columns were ready. She said, "I don't know yet. Something is owed, I think. To myself. A reckoning of a different kind." She paused. "I should like to do some legal reading." Lord Selwyn looked at her with the expression she had seen on his face in the library on that first Tuesday, the warm-lined smile. "Your grandmother did some legal reading," he said. "She found it improved her understanding of what was possible. I should imagine it would." He was quiet a moment. "I have a nephew," he said, "who is a magistrate in the Northern Circuit. He is 38, and he has working hands that his rank does not precisely require, and he is the kind of man who reads field surveys with the same attention other men give to horses, and he has been remarkably difficult to introduce to anyone sensible." She looked at him. He looked at the hall, with the comfortable expression of a man who has said a thing he intended to say, and is now making no further claims on it. "He sounds very dull," Emmeline said. "He is not remotely dull. He is merely not yet known." "Then, perhaps," she said, "he should be." The autumn turned, as it had been threatening to turn since September, with the sudden decisiveness of a season that has been patiently waiting for the right moment. The trees went all at once, and the light changed, and the mornings had a new quality, still, bright, clear-edged, the kind of mornings in which everything looks precisely like what it is. His name was Aldrich Selwyn, and he arrived at Ashford Hall 3 weeks after his uncle, on the pretext of some documentation requiring Lord Selwyn's counter-signature that could equally well have been sent by post, and Emmeline was in the estate office with Mr. Greaves discussing drainage when Mrs. Pottle appeared in the doorway with an expression that communicated approximately 7 separate things, the most important of which was, "He is not what I expected." He was not what she had expected either. She had expected Lord Selwyn in younger, softer form, and what she found was someone more angular and more still, with hands that had exactly the calluses she had been told to expect, and eyes that were the dark brown of river stones, worn smooth, she would think later, by a great deal of looking. He shook hands with Mr. Greaves as though Mr. Greaves were the man he had come to meet, which was either excellent manners or genuine interest, and she spent the first quarter-hour categorizing the difference. She concluded genuine interest. He asked Mr. Greaves 3 questions about the Elmore drainage situation that were the right 3 questions, and listened to all 3 answers with the particular quality of attention that distinguishes a person who is hearing from a person who is merely waiting for the silence to end. He had come with the documentation, which was real, and which he had read because he knew the figures in it and did not make her walk through them. He asked about the eastern parcels. She told him. He asked 2 follow-up questions that told her he had read the deed, which was either his uncle's briefing or his own research, and she found, somewhat to her own surprise, that it mattered to her which it was. "The deed," she said. "Did you read it before you came?" "After," he said. "I borrowed it from my uncle when I was invited to supper on the 14th. He had been talking about it for a month." A pause. "He had also been talking about you." "He said you were sensible," Emmeline said. "He said you were thorough." He looked at the estate map on Mr. Greaves's table, and his hand moved toward the eastern edge and stopped before it touched the paper. The gesture of a man who knows where the boundaries of other people's work are. He did not say you were thorough enough to catch an apothecary's correspondence by reading the texture of the paper through an envelope. Mr. Greaves cleared his throat and found a reason to step outside. I didn't, she said. I caught it because his thumbnail leaves a mark on documents he's read. He pressed the wrong corner one morning in July, and I was standing close enough to see it. She looked at him steadily. Anyone paying attention would have noticed. He looked at her with something that she could not immediately classify, which was unusual. She classified most things immediately. My uncle, he said, has been trying for 6 years to introduce me to women who are paying attention. And most of them, he said, were paying attention to my uncle's estate. She said nothing, which was not the nothing of having nothing to say. It was the nothing of choosing not to spend the obvious reply, because it was worth more held than spoken. He seemed to understand this, because his expression changed in a small specific way that she filed immediately, the look of a man who has said something that he expected to close a door, and has found instead that it opened one. You will want to see the eastern parcels, she said, since you read the survey. Very much, he said. They walked the east farms in the afternoon, which was long and golden in the way October afternoons are golden when they decide to be, and they talked about drainage and deed law and the particular problem of timber rights in entailed estates, and it was the most direct, most intelligent conversation she had had in 4 years, possibly longer. And it had not cost her the performance of a single thing she was not. She noticed, walking, that his left hand had a small scar across the palm, which matched Lord Selwyn's left hand, and she concluded it was a family habit or a family accident, and found she did not need to know which. He noticed the sparrow that accompanied them for half the walk, and made a remark about it so dry that she laughed before she could decide to, which surprised him and then, after one moment's assessment, clearly pleased him, though he only showed this by looking away at the hedgerow with the careful expression of a man regulating something. She noted the regulation. She filed it beside everything else she had filed since he arrived. By the time they turned back toward the hall, the file was substantial. He stayed 3 days. On the 3rd day, he came to her study without being sent for, knocked, waited, and came in when asked. He had the documentation he had technically come for, which was finished and signed. He had also, apparently, brought something else. He put it on her desk. It was a small book of legal essays, clearly old, clearly read many times, with his uncle's name on the flyleaf and a faint ink mark on the 3rd page where someone had underlined a sentence so long ago that the mark had faded to sepia. She picked it up. The sentence read, "The great advantage of an honest account is that it cannot be improved upon. One has only to show it." She looked at him. "He said you should have it," Aldrich said. "He said it was the book that taught him what the law is for. What is it for?" He stood in the middle of her study with the afternoon on the window behind him and his hands at his sides, and he considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "For making the count public," he said, "so that the right people can see what the numbers actually are." She turned the book in her hands. She looked at the underlined sentence. She thought about ledgers and deeds and the particular freedom of a figure that has been correctly kept, that can be shown to anyone in any light, and will say the same thing it has always said. "If I were to read this," she said, "I would want to discuss it. I had thought," he said carefully, "that I might come back in December. The roads in December are very variable." "Yes," a pause. "I have a good horse." She put the book on the corner of her desk, precisely aligned, which was her particular composure gesture and which he had, she noticed. He did not comment. He looked at the book's placement with the expression of a man who has handed something over and is gratified to see it kept, and then he left. And she listened to his horse on the gravel drive until it was gone, and she picked up the book and read the first essay, and it was very good. He came back in December, and January, and March, and by April, the thing between them had been named. Not officially, but in the way things are named, when two people who are exceptionally good at reading figures have been reading the same figure long enough to know what it says. It was April when he stopped midway through a sentence about a case before the Chancery Court and said, with the abrupt precision of a man who has been accumulating something for several months and has decided to spend it all at once, "I should like to ask you to marry me. I want to be careful about how I ask, because I have been thinking about how to ask for some time, and I want to make sure you understand that the question has nothing to do with your grandmother's deed, or the hall, or anything that is yours by right and law and your own considerable work. I am asking because I cannot think of anyone else I would rather argue about drainage surveys with for the rest of my natural life, and because you laugh before you decide to, which is the most honest thing I have ever seen a person do." She looked at him for a long moment. "I am not in any particular situation," she said. "You understand that. I am not in need of rescue or settlement or arrangement. I am very well. I know. And if I said yes, it would be because I wished to. That is the only reason I will take," he said. She thought about her grandmother, who had built a hall and a deed and raised a granddaughter precisely so that one day she could say yes because she wished to, and for no other reason on earth. She thought about the afternoon on the East Farms, and the sparrow, and the book on her desk, and the way he looked when she laughed without deciding to. "December," she said, "when the roads are variable." He smiled, and it was the first time she had seen him smile with his whole face, without the regulation, and she filed it alongside everything else she had been keeping. In the ledger she had been building since October, which was the most important account she had ever maintained. The wedding was small, as she had always intended any wedding of hers to be. It was in the hall chapel, which her grandmother had built alongside the hall, and which smelled of old stone and November, and the particular cold warmth of a room that had been used with genuine purpose for a long time. Lord Selwyn gave her away and wept without apology, which was the most surprising thing she had ever seen him do, and which she would tell him so, later, which made him laugh, which made him cry again. Mrs. Pottle wore her best gray and kept her expression to a precise and dignified pride for the duration of the ceremony, and then, the moment it was over, turned to Mr. Greaves and said something that made him cover his mouth and look at the ceiling. The undergardeners had put early flowers on every available surface, which was excessive and entirely correct. Rue had been given a very good character reference and a position in Northumberland, which was far enough to be a fresh beginning and close enough to be reached if he ever needed to be. He had left in November without making difficulties, which she had thought he would not, and he had not. The Duke of Ashford signed the administration arrangement in December, when Lord Selwyn's office brought the Dunmore settlement for his signature, and he had signed it without further contest, and afterward he had written Emmeline a letter of precisely 6 lines that contained one sentence she had read twice. "I believe I have not previously understood what it costs to be overlooked." She had put the letter in the back of her grandmother's household management text, which was where she put the things that did not fit any other category. There was no word from Lady Vane, but in March there was a small notice in the county news that the Western property had a new tenant from the city, a woman on her own, who had taken up the kitchen garden with considerable energy and was spoken of by the local tradespeople as a person who paid her accounts promptly and on the exact day agreed. Emmeline read this and thought about pity, and about arithmetic, and about the waste of good intelligence in the service of insufficient ends, and she hoped the kitchen garden proved sufficient. About a year after the October morning that Emmeline had stood in a doorway and heard her husband name his mistress in her grandmother's hall. She was in the estate office with the new household accounts ledger when Aldrich came in from the East Farms with mud on his boots and a letter from Lord Selwyn in his hand. He dropped the letter on the desk, his desk now, which had been made his by the addition of a second chair and a second inkstand and an ongoing argument about the proper method of filing survey documents. And he shed the muddy coat and said, "He wants us in the north for August. We have the harvest accounts in August." I told him that. And? He said Mr. Greaves is perfectly capable of the harvest accounts and that you coddle him. She looked up. He was leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed, which was his particular doorframe posture, the one that meant he had done a long day's work outside and found it satisfying, and had come in to find something inside that was equally satisfying, and had found it, and was therefore very well. He had not trimmed his hair since February, which she had mentioned twice and intended to mention again. "We will go in August," she said, "if you trim your hair before we leave." "That seems," he said, "like an extremely transactional condition." "I am," she said, "an extremely transactional person." He came across the room and picked up the pen she had set down, which was not the dominance gesture that it had once been in this room from another man. It was, from him, the gesture of someone who wanted to look at what she had been working on, and she knew the difference. And the knowing of the difference was its own kind of account, correctly kept. He put the pen down. He looked at the columns she had been filling in. "The East Farms are going to come in well this year." "I know," she said. "I've been watching the drainage." He looked at the figures, and then at her, with the specific look she had been receiving since April of the previous year, and which had not in that time lost any of its quality. Which was the look of a man who is still, after all the accounting is done, gratified by the figure the books returned. Outside, on the window ledge, the sparrow that had been on every relevant ledge of this story sang its particular song, because November was months away, and the morning was clear, and it had every reason to. She squared the ledger, corner to corner, and the page before her was full of honest figures, every one of them correct. If this story warmed you, if you have ever been the one in the room doing the careful work that nobody's watching, the one who kept the count when the count was the only thing that would matter, then you already know what Emmeline knew, and perhaps what her grandmother knew before her, that the truth, honestly kept, can wait as long as it needs to. We keep the fire lit here for exactly that kind of story. There is always a chair by the hearth, and the kettle is always nearly ready. If you stay a while, I would love to know, what was the moment you knew in this story that Emmeline had already won? Leave it in the comments. It is not a small question, and I find your answers are never small answers. If you would like to find your chair here again, a quiet subscription keeps the light on. Until next time, sleep well and be generous with the ones who kept your lamp burning when you could not see to do it yourself.